So what is the future of global oil prices? I'm being asked this question in March 2011 at a time when civil war is raging in Libya. The Tunisian government has just fallen, Egypt has fallen, and there are protests on the streets in 3 or 4 other Arab countries with big questions being asked about the security of the global oil supply. Here are a couple of facts. Despite the global downturn, many of the world's largest emerging nations continued their strong economic growth at a level with 2 or 3 or 4 times that seen in many developed countries over the last 3 years. I'm thinking of countries like China and India, Brazil and so on. And this economic growth, which is powering the future of most of the world's population, will continue to drive demand for just about every commodity. It doesn't matter whether it's copper, steel, oil, coal, whatever you think of, the demand will be there. So that's part of the backdrop. The other part of the backdrop is that as oil prices have continued to rise beyond the critical point of around $70 a barrel, many alternative energy programs have become much more economically viable. And just about every corporation is busy looking to save money and to be green at the same time. Green, yes, because it's a good thing to do for the sake of the planet. But green also because it just makes so much economic sense because of the speed at which you get a financial return from investing in things like new boilers, new air conditioning, new heat recovery systems, and so on. Now, there's a balance between these different things, and the higher the oil price goes, the larger the world's oil reserves become. That's because, at the moment, a big chunk of the world's oil reserves are in places where it's just not economic to get the oil out. Now, we do also see a great challenge in terms of episodic interruptions. Big step up in piracy, which perhaps could effectively close parts of the Suez Canal or the whole of the access to the Suez Canal for a period of time. A big event, let's say the collapse of the Saudi royal family's regime. But the underlying issues which will drive oil prices, as I say, are the balance between consumption and production over a 5 to 10 year period. Now, some people talk about peak oil. They say that we have already achieved the maximum amount of global output that we will ever see in the history of humankind. I would question that. It's all an issue of how much production you want to put in over the next 3 or 4 years, 5 years, 10 years, how quickly you want to deplete those fields, and as I say, what the oil price is anyway during that period, which gives us the opportunity to extract more. If oil prices were to go beyond a certain point, then history would be rewound back to just about any petroleum-type product we obtained from warming coal and getting its gases out, then heating it further and getting its oils out, and then producing coke, which is a smokeless fuel which is then burnt in power stations. Could we do that? Yes, we could. How much coal have we got? Enough to last us several hundred years. So ultimately, oil prices will reach a ceiling beyond which they are unlikely to rise further. Now, we could debate about where that is and what we could afford, but here is another issue. If we look at oil prices as they are right now, as I'm making this video, they're hovering around $110 a barrel. We need to look back to the 1970s and recognize that if we adjusted for the high prices in the late 1970s, as they were then, and add on inflation, we would land up with an oil price of around $100, $110 today. In other words, those who are shouting and screaming that the world can hardly afford $110 a barrel need to think again. It's $110 a barrel as an oil price is not so far off where they were in real terms back in the 1970s. It's true that we had the big oil shock then, which set off a great recession in many countries. But we are much less dependent in many developed nations today as a proportion of our economies on the oil price than we were back then. In fact, a country like the US has perhaps only 1/3 of the dependency it had back in the mid to late 1970s. So it is unlikely, even if oil prices were to tip up at $150 to $160 a barrel and to stay there, it's unlikely that the United States would be hit in quite the same way. Having said that, of course, we are still recovering from a mega shock which hit us in 2008, 2009, 2010 with the subprime crisis and the global contagion which then followed. and many economies are in a relatively weak state, so that if the oil prices were to push things down further, it would be quite difficult for governments to put a further economic stimulus to counterbalance that. So we are in uncertain and interesting times. But if I had to place a bet, I'd place on oil prices on the whole staying around or above $100 a barrel rather than well below. I can't see oil prices going back down to $35 a barrel, for example, for very long, because it would just stimulate the most gigantic boom in consumption and indeed would be very bad for our planet.